Hi, my name is Patricia. I am also from Seattle, but have a lot of mixed ancestry. On my father's side of the family, I am Tlingit Alaskan from Southeast Alaska, like Juneau area, Sitka, Ketchikan. Those are a lot of the Tlingit villages that we have. On my mother's side, we are Afro-Caribbean, as well as mixed with Mohawk and Seneca from the northeast coast. And I am currently an elected official for my tribe on tribal council for the Southeast tribes of Tlingit and Haida. So I might give a little bit more of a tribal governance perspective to a lot of these issues and things that we're discussing. My mother's people came to Seattle during the Great Migration of Black families from the East Coast and the South coming to the Midwest and to the West to have refuge for having a better life, getting away from Jim Crow laws. And so we've been displaced in different ways in Seattle historically during redlining, which restricted people from being able to live outside of certain areas within the city because of their ethnic background or their nationalities. And so it wasn't until about the 70s when families could really effectively leave the areas where they originally were forced onto into Seattle and be able to actually buy property, buy businesses outside of those areas. And so because of that, there's a lot of, I grew up being involved in the community from a very civil rights lens, and then when I got much more into human rights, the more kind of global international human rights perspective, I started learning about how food access, food sovereignty, climate change all deeply affects human rights, and that they have parallels very similar to tribal law. If you study tribal law, it's such a big umbrella for many different types of laws, whether it's land, property rights, whether it's food accessibility, environmental laws, international treaties, for example. And so I really wanted to first kind of buffer into the conversation by noting how a lot of, when we talk about founding fathers, when we talk about the creation of domestic law here in the United States, when we talk about the Constitution, much of that is taken from indigenous laws, especially the Great Law of Peace, for example, of the many Northeast tribes, because there were nations before the United States was formed. There were very complex nations and complex laws within the original tribal nations and tribes within the United States. And so there's a lot of difference, though, in interpretation. Much of the laws in the United States are focused on individual rights. It's very individualistic, versus the indigenous laws and things that were concepts before the U.S. were much more focused on responsibility and collective protection and collective understanding of who you are, what your rights and responsibilities are. So that's why when we talk about indigenous law, when we talk about treaty laws especially, which are federal laws, and some of the only federal laws that actually protect the environment right now, it's not just necessarily one person, one individual tribe protecting self. It also has a lot to do with the dynamics of the environment around them, the indigeneity of the different elements of nature, of land, of animals, of food especially. And so there's a lot going on right now in regards to that. And so especially when it comes to pipelines, drilling, different things like that. Right now, we've made a lot of agreements with Canada around fracking, buying oil for the LNG pipeline. It's affected the Puyallup tribe, for example. And we were talking earlier about Standing Rock and the violation of those international treaties between the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and the United States and the Army Corps of Engineers. Another example for my tribe, specifically in Southeast Alaska, is there's a huge issue of huge carbon emissions from cruise ships, as well as huge acidification in the Pacific Ocean. Cruise ships on a daily basis give out 170,000 gallons of gray water each day, and as well as 21,000 gallons of sewage. And so those are deeply and heavily affecting, for example, the orca crisis that we've been going through the Northwest, the consumption, the lack of them being able to consume wild salmon, and the growing acidification of the Salish Sea or the Puget Sound as well. And so a lot of what our tribe's efforts have been doing was reducing the amount of cruise ships that we allow to go through Southeast Alaska and throughout the Northwest, lowering a lot of the carbon emissions, and also restricting where cruise ships are dumping their oil, because a lot of the time they're dumping it within 2 nautical miles from shore, and now they're not supposed to be doing that, and so now there's been a larger restriction of that. And so that being another example of food sovereignty, and so sovereignty being something that's incredibly important for Indigenous communities, not just nationally in the United States, but internationally. And so when we're talking about Indigenous people, Indigenous communities as well in the United States, we have to recognize global Indigenous communities. And so something that I know has been an issue, not just in Washington, but definitely here in Oregon, is a lot of immigration rights, understanding of refugees, and who they are, why those communities are coming here. And so from an international human rights, especially in Latin America standpoint, it's important to acknowledge that, for example, in Central America, food and environment has deeply affected a lot of immigration and refugee communities. For example, Guatemala, they recently had huge conflicts within the 80s and 90s, especially, that were really deeply pushed by the United Fruit Company in the US, pushing for land to be owned and overseen by US corporations, which has displaced many Mayan communities, and really caused a lot of violence and what they actually really acknowledge as genocide coming into the US. And then another example was the assassination of Berta Casares from Honduras, and fighting for environmentalism and food justice, as well as what's going on right now regarding a lot of Mayan communities in Mexico around fuel refining, aeronautical development around building another airport to alleviate some of the traffic of Mexico City, as well as rail transportation to promote more green tourism within Chiapas and the Yucatan Peninsula as well, that are really deeply affecting Mayan communities. But really quickly, I wanted to touch as well on even more issues regarding people coming out and migrating because of these environmental issues and environmental developments. For example, in Venezuela, right now, there's a lot of question as to what is going on in Venezuela. There's a lot of misunderstandings, and a lot of it is the lack of addressing the environmental issues going on, especially the fact that Venezuela is the largest. They hold the largest amount of crude oil and petroleum exports in the world, pretty much. And so the U.S. buys over 41% of their fossil fuels and crude oil, and they had actually cut ties with Venezuela because Venezuela created an initiative to have state-owned crude oil. And so the U.S. Secretary said that they would avoid sanctions by recognizing the opposing leader of Venezuela. And so they don't want to buy the oil, but then they also have this kind of monoculture of exports in Venezuela. And so these types of things are really deeply affecting the way people are eating. People are not having access to even 2 meals a day. They're having to revert back to what's considered kind of food for people with lower incomes. They're not getting necessarily the same amount of nutrients that they would normally have access to. And so another example being the Cobell case of international indigenous laws right now. The biggest, really quickly, the biggest the biggest class action case right now going on that just got finished being settled is the Coal Belt case for Indigenous people here in the U.S. Because the U.S. Was overseeing a lot of the tribal lands that wasn't individually owned by tribal enrolled members of different tribes. And so right now, over 500,000 Native people are getting reimbursed for leases that the government has given out. So there are different ways that people are being able to address and heal some of these international issues and national issues as well. Thank you.